So I've been thinking about independent thinking lately and how many people struggle with it today. A lot of it comes from social media or a news bias, usually political or ideological bias. And I wanted to talk about today's topics, but look at it through a world or a lens of independent thinking. Now, most people do have some sort of religious or political or ideological bias, and that's okay. But sometimes it's good to think about things independently. So I want to talk about news. I want to talk about some things going on in the world. We're not just going to have straight facts. We are going to have some analysis and some conclusions, but I want to think about things independently. So let's go over some rules first. Anytime we talk about news, anytime we come to conclusions, I want to apply these rules. Number one, there's not going to be a bait and switch. What do I mean by that? I mean, I'm not going to say something like, well, after looking at all the facts and all the data and thinking independently, you should now vote for X. Or say that now the right belief is conservative or liberal or whatever. There will be no bait and switch. My goal isn't to directly lead you to believe one specific thing about some sort of ideological belief. And the second thing is you may be led to certain opinions based on our discussion, but that is your choice. I'm not going to try to point you necessarily in one direction. Number three is we will look at the truth. So let's talk about number four, which is how we define the truth. We define it by facts, data, and historical evidence. Think of the way of independent thinking as something as a scientific process. We look at conclusions, but we base those conclusions off of facts, ideas, data, historical evidence. So those are the four rules that we will look for independent thinking when we come to news, topics, things going on in the world, or even history. Let's take a quick example of those rules, and then we'll get on to some news today. So if I were to follow the rules, I might say something like, the Catholic Pope is a real and influential person throughout history and today. Now, whether you're Catholic, atheist, or a different religion, you can agree on all those things. He's a real person, he exists, and he is influential and has been influential in the past. Now, if I were to not follow those rules, I might say something like, the Catholic is one of the most important people in the history of the world, and you should considering following his ways and become Catholic. That would obviously be breaking the rules. So let's get started with some news today. And I am going to talk about tariffs because we know we love to talk about tariffs. And in today's world, they're so divisive, mostly because of the person it's coming from. Let's talk about the Wall Street Journal. They had an article come out last night that said, how tariffs are crushing small businesses. Quote, nobody in power seems to care. So lately, people have said that the Wall Street Journal is hating on Donald Trump. I tend to look at the Wall Street Journal. I love to read the Wall Street Journal. I read it several times every week, sometimes daily. But lately, a lot of what they've talked about is Donald Trump, tariffs, how Donald Trump is bad, how tariffs are bad. And you can think that. You can think tariffs are bad, Donald Trump is bad. But reading the same thing over and over again can get difficult, and it can make people feel like they have a bias against Donald Trump. So let's look at a few things from this article. The owner of a San Francisco card game company cashed in his money market funds. The founder of Tent Maker is looking for investors. A watch and jewelry company in Colorado is holding off on signing a new office lease. And a New Hampshire consumer product has laid off more than half its staffs. So right there, it's kind of giving you a picture of what's going on with these tariffs. Now, the biggest tariff, as we know right now, is between China and the United States. These two tariffs are causing some sort of contention between businesses in the United States as well as between the two countries. Now, there hasn't been a lot of logical discussion around tariffs, and this article actually breaks down some of the impacts of tariffs, and it's pretty good to help you understand how tariffs impact business owners. So right now there's 145% tariff on Chinese imports. So if you're a business owner and you're importing Chinese products and you're selling those Chinese products here, your bill is huge, right? It's whatever the cost of the product is. Let's say it's $5. plus 145%. So it's over $10, probably close to what, $12, $13 to get that product in. Now, the thing with tariffs is you have to decide, am I going to push that extra cost to my consumer? So probably someone who's spending $5 to buy a product normally, I don't know, they're probably selling it for $20 or so, maybe $25. Now, that would mean that they probably have somewhere around a $15 to $20 profit margin, assuming that there are other costs along the way, it would be a little bit smaller. Now, take that from a $15 profit margin to maybe something like a $7, maybe $12 profit margin. That drops down quite a bit once you add in tariffs. So do I pass that extra cost to the consumer or not? Now, there's a lot of issues with tariffs that come along with supply line issues. And a lot of people quote old tariffs in history, like the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1931, and they created huge problems. The world was way different back then, but we're not going to talk about that. Right now, what we're going to talk about is there's not a lot of logical and independent thinking when it comes to tariffs. In this article, there is some facts and some good data in here, and it's actually something that will help you understand what's going on. They talk about $8,752 fee on a $5,649 order. They're not saying that a $5,649 order is now $8,752. They're saying it's, let's see, $56.49 plus $87.52. Now, an order that used to be, let's say it was zero tariffs before, $56.49 is now $14,401. That's really important to understand. So let's get down to the independent thinking part of it. Okay. Right now, there's not a lot of independent thinking when it comes to tariffs. Hear me out. So right now, most people are saying Trump equals tariffs. If you think Trump is bad, you think tariffs are bad. Now, there is logic behind some of that. It's not like Trump bad, tariff bad, but Trump bad, tariff equals extra cost, like explained in this Wall Street Journal article. In this case, $8,752. That's bad. Okay, I think we can agree with that. But let's keep going. Now, if you look at this from the other perspective, Trump good equals tariffs good, right? Trump good, tariff good. Now, there is logic behind that too. I'm not going to sit here and say that neither side or one side has logic and the other doesn't. Now, normally people who think that these tariffs are bad, and I'm going to go ahead and say people who are liberal leaning, Democrat leaning, often focus on higher taxes to add revenue or to add a cost so that the bigger companies can pay their fair share. Today, they're saying that taxes are bad. Now, okay, my goal is to kind of point out the hypocrisy of both sides of these arguments from an independent thinking. I'm not trying to say that liberals are wrong and Republicans are right, or vice versa. Republicans are wrong, liberals are right. My goal is to say independent thinking wise, people just aren't looking at this the right way. So if we look at this, people who normally say lower taxes are better, they create more economic movement, are kind of pro-Trump, therefore they're pro-tariffs. So you can see the logic there that's not sitting on there. I think what we can all agree upon is the lower the taxes, the less money anyone pays. No matter what your economic belief is, if taxes are lower, then consumers and businesses are paying less. Now, those people who like tariffs right now or love Trump, therefore love the tariff policies, they adopt the belief generally that, hey, if you just buy American, then you avoid the taxes. American products are more expensive, and therefore we're looking at something of a price increase regardless. So we're kind of at this level of tariffs where we're struggling with independent thinking. And here's my thoughts. Theoretically, the best case scenario is Trump puts all these tariffs on countries, but they all come to some sort of trade agreement, right? If they all come to a trade agreement, then, hear me out, hopefully the tariffs go down for everyone. We want trade to be overwhelming, right? We want the U.S. to trade with other countries. People and countries, people and businesses in the United States, we want them to ship their businesses overseas. We also want to get cheaper products overseas into the United States. Now, here's some things that I think about it. Right now, a lot of people are like, tariffs are bad. And then the argument is, if tariffs are bad, then why are other countries putting tariffs on the US? I think ultimately tariffs are the worst for the country that it's being imposed upon. However, they are price increases for both sides, potentially. So, best case scenario is Donald Trump, the president of the United States, come to an agreement with other countries to reduce tariffs across the board. Best case scenario is there's no tariffs whatsoever. I think we could probably all agree on that. Everyone could freely trade and give money to other countries. I should say, everyone should be able to give their products to other countries for money getting back to them. Okay, so best case scenario, there is trade. There is a very, very cheap trade. Countries can be very efficient. So let's say China can very efficiently bring a good high quality plastic product to the United States. We could buy it for cheap, use it here, and companies in the US can sell it. But maybe the US, for example, could go make really efficient, cheap t-shirts. I'm just making stuff up, but make t-shirts, sell it to China. China could buy it for us for really cheap, and they could sell it for their citizens. Now, if you add tariffs, which both sides are mashing tariffs together, and you start to see that there are some issues here. All right, let's talk about next the stock market and how it's reacting to this potential trade deal with the United States. We're just going to keep looking at the Wall Street Journal. Like I said, I love to read the Wall Street Journal, and you may agree or disagree, and you may think that they're pro or anti one belief, but I like to look at it. Generally, there's a little bit of bias in everything you read, but our goal is to just figure out some facts. All right, so let's go through a few things. A few days ago, it would almost seem impossible, but on Monday, the surprise of global investors in everyday business fearing a trade war, the US and China agreed to a truce. The world's two biggest economies unwound for now most of the tariffs they had imposed on each other since April in a tit-for-tat battle that was threatening to stoke US inflation, crash China's export engine, and upend the global economy. Stock markets in the US and elsewhere surged on the news. The dollar and bond yields rose, reflections expectations of faster US growth as trade tensions recede. Exporters breathe a sigh of release. Okay, so if we look at the Dow Jones, it's up 2.64%. If we look at the S&P, it's up 3.1%. The Nasdaq's up 4.2%. At this point, Liberation Day that happened from Donald Trump a few weeks ago, stock markets just had a terrible week, terrible couple days. We're almost back to where we were at record highs. We're not quite there because it dropped, 15, 20%, and it takes a lot of time and high growth to get back. But here's the thing. You might think, wow, Donald Trump is amazing. He just brought the stock markets back. Without thinking independently, that might be your conclusion. You might also say, well, Donald Trump caused the stock market to go down. That's true, right? Donald Trump doesn't necessarily control the stock market, but ultimately the stock market doesn't like tariffs. People don't like tariffs or stocks, or people don't like tariffs or taxes ultimately, right? Especially economists, especially traders. They don't like things to interfere with commerce, and tariffs, taxes. Those are those things. So right now the stock market said, bravo, thank you for changing this. Thank you for making it go back to where it was before. And the stock market is responding very positively. So how can we think of this independently? Well, for one, it's pretty clear that traders, that investors prefer lower taxes, lower tariffs, right? I think we can come to that conclusion. Now, there is a possibility that the stock market is overreacting and tomorrow maybe it goes down a little bit, or trade discussions we find out aren't that extensive, and ultimately all they did was get rid of the tariffs they had before. That is possible. But if we're to look at this in a long-term impact and say, what if what the tariffs were before Liberation Day from Donald Trump, and he added an extra 165% or whatever it was, what if the tariffs were to go down from what the rate was before all of this mess happened? Then what would happen? Okay, so our conclusion is that the stock market doesn't like tariffs, right? I think we can all agree on that regardless of your ideological political beliefs. The stock market doesn't like tariffs. Now, anytime President Trump rolls back tariffs, the stock market spikes up, right? When he adds more tariffs, the stock market goes down. Now, the question, if we were to look at this independently, scientifically, if you will, is what if tariffs go even lower than what they were before all this tariff mess happened? So, for example, let's say China, I think, had something like 140% tariff on us. What if they drop down to 25%, which is lower when they're lower than what they were before? What would happen then? Would the stock market completely explode in a good way? Maybe. That's really the ultimate scenario for the stock market. We've already come to the conclusion that the stock market doesn't like tariffs. If President Trump were to bring tariffs down all the way or significantly lower than what they were before, especially imposed upon the United States, that would be a good thing for the stock market. So that's a little exercise on thinking independently when it comes to something like tariffs. All right. Let's talk about the last piece of information. We're going to go to the White House and look at, this is going to be our last thing for today, but we're going to look at the prescription drug pricing to American patients. So last night, Sunday, the president discussed bringing down prescription drug prices for the United States. And he said at the time that it would be something like a 30 to 50% drop in drug prices. Okay, on the surface, that's a good thing. I'm not saying below the surface is a bad thing, but we're just looking at this independently, looking at this through the surface. So let's look through some of this executive order. Okay, by authority vested in me as president and by the Constitution of the United States of America, it is hereby ordered. The United States has less than 5% of the world's population and yet funds around 3/4 of global pharmaceutical profits. Now, I am inferring a little bit, and he gets to it, but what he's saying essentially is that the pharmaceutical profits come from 75% come from the United States. The inference here is that the United States pays the bills of pharmaceutical companies. Now, let's start with some assumptions. I think everyone can probably agree, regardless of what you believe in, that prices are pretty high in the United States. Some people will talk about socialized healthcare, how prices are extremely low or sometimes free, and say the United States struggles with its healthcare system. I don't know if I necessarily agree or disagree with that, but what I will say is it's expensive in the United States. We still have insurance, but insurance rates are expensive. So I think we can all agree on that. Some people say that the government should do its best to bring down prices. Some people should say the government shouldn't interfere and let the free markets do its thing. Well, the government has interfered. So if you're on one side, which is the government should do things to bring it down, then look at this. This is happening. So the United States has for too long turned its back on Americans who unwittingly sponsor both drug manufacturers and other countries. These entities today rely on price markups on American consumers, generous public subsidies for research and development primary through the National Institutes of Health, and robust public financing of prescription drug consumption through federal and state healthcare programs. Drug manufacturers, rather than seeking to equalize evidence price discrimination, agree to other countries' demand for lower prices and simultaneously fight against the ability for public and private players in the United States to negotiate prices for its patients. Last line here, inflated prices of the United States fuel global innovation while foreign health systems give a free ride. So this is clearly a damning look at the pharmaceutical business when it comes to how they are treating the United States consumers, at least through what President Trump is saying here in his executive order. So what's actually going to happen? Section 2 says that there will be a policy. Americans should not be forced to subsidize low-cost prescription drugs and buy in other developed countries and face overcharges for the same products in the United States. Section 3, addressing foreign nations freeloading on American-financed innovation. The Secretary of Commerce and the United States Trade Representative shall take a necessary and appropriate action to ensure foreign countries are not engaged in any policy, act, or practice that may be unreasonable or discriminatory or that may impair United States national security that has effect of forcing American patients to pay for disproportionate amount of global pharmaceutical research and development. And it goes on a little bit more. So I don't know what's actually going to happen, how the president is going to do this, but I think that like some conclusions we could come to is like most people agree that the Americans are paying a lot for pharmaceuticals, for drugs, for their surgeries. And I can tell you this personally, I just had my gallbladder removed a couple weeks ago, and it's going to be very expensive. It's not the end of the world, right? Like my wife and I can afford it, and we're going to have to pay for it over some payments, but we're going to be fine, right? It's not the end of the world. But I can attest to, yeah, stuff is expensive here. If I lived in a socialized country, let's say maybe Canada, where the medical field is socialized or paid for through the government, maybe I wouldn't have that bill. Now, I think we can all agree, you can look up the data, that it would probably have taken longer. I'd probably still have my gallbladder today in Canada because that stuff takes longer. By the time that I had the stuff looked at me in my body, and the time my regular doctor looked at it, and then a specialist looked at it and said I need to get my gallbladder removed because of risks, it was about maybe 6 weeks total between that time and the time I actually got my gallbladder removed. Now, you may think, okay, well, 6 weeks, that's not too bad. It's actually way better than you might think because I had multiple doctor's appointments. I had to get an MRI. I had to get testing. And all of those were like a few days between, a couple weeks between each appointment. And eventually we had, the doctor had to put a time past the MRI. And ultimately, 6 weeks wasn't too bad from the time that they checked my gallbladder to the time that they took it out a couple weeks ago. I think what we can conclude is other countries would have taken 6 months, maybe 2 years, depending on the urgency of the issue. And right now, it wasn't necessarily urgent. It wasn't, if it didn't come out, I might die. So other countries, it would take longer. Again, this is unbiased. This is true. This is fact. Canada has specifically very slow, specialized healthcare. Now, I think we can also agree it's probably cheaper in Canada, at least out of pocket for me. Now, Canada, you probably pay that in your taxes, right? So your tax bill's higher, but your out of pocket is lower. In the United States, your tax bill is lower, your out of pocket is higher. You pay insurance plus extra costs, which I do. So, long story short, what's going to happen here? Will these impose sanctions on the pharmaceutical companies actually impact U.S. consumers in a good way? Well, here's a few ways to think about it. Usually, not always, but usually the price you pay for drugs isn't the actual price that the pharmacy is charging. Your insurance is covering some of that cost. Now, there's, of course, discussions around generic pharmaceuticals and how those are much cheaper, blah, 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 right? The goal isn't to think about those, but the goal is to think about how will prices actually come down and how will it impact you? Now, let's say prices go down by 50%, which President Trump hopes for. That's awesome, right? However, let's say a drug you need post-surgery like mine is $100, but you only pay $15 after your insurance. Now, if prices comes down, is it saying you're only going to pay $7.50? Or is the drug no longer going to be $100, it's going to be $50, and insurance will only cover let's say the same amount, you still pay $15, or the same percentage, which means it doesn't go down half. It might go down from $15 to, let's say, $11 instead of the $7.50. We don't know yet. We don't know if it's actually going to work, how that looks, and we don't know the long-term impacts. What we do know is that there does seem to be some sort of push to make the American consumer have to pay less and put less burden on the American consumer based on this information. So is President Trump right to do this? All right, here's the thing. I bet if you hate President Trump, you'll probably be thinking right now of why this is a bad idea. Let's be honest. If you love Donald Trump, you might be thinking of why this is a great idea. Here's the thing. It's hard to say whether it's actually going to work or not. We don't know. But independently thinking, we can think if prices do come down for U.S. citizens, actual prices, out-of-pocket prices, I think we can agree that that's a good thing. We don't know if it's going to happen or how it's going to happen. We don't know if insurance costs will go up. That would be a bad thing, right? If your insurance rate go up because of this, that's bad. You know, if you pay less out of pocket for a drug, but guess what? Your rates spike up. That's a bad thing. I think we can all agree upon that. So what we hope for is lower prices for our drugs, the same or lower prices for our insurance, and less of a burden on the American people. I think that's what the president's going for here. Is it going to work? We'll have to wait and see what the data says in the long term. So I hope you enjoyed my show. This is just my show. Normally, I'm on Freedom Finances, and we talk about financial news, financial tips. You can visit us at freedomfinances.org. But this is just my show. This is some stuff that isn't necessarily about finances. I want to do this more often and talk to everyone in a more open environment where we can have a discussion. Please leave some comments and thoughts on what we talked about today. And I just challenge everyone to think independently. How are these things impacting you independently? And do you struggle looking through things through a non-ideological lens? Or do you know I have an ideological belief, whether it's conservative, liberal, whatever, but I can actually read the news or see a video and like cipher through some of the BS and some of the facts and data. So thanks for joining me. We're going to do this a lot more often. See ya.